the Mises Machines class, and today we have the honor of greeting Mr. Andrew Coward, who is going to be delivering a fairly brief lecture, about a half hour, and definitely want to leave time for student questions. Just by way of introduction, the Machine Perception Cognitive Robotics Lab, William and I have been following our work for quite a number of years now. It's really a very interesting approach. Mr. Coward comes from a background of studying complex electronic systems and has brought sort of the perspective of trying to understand brain function at a very broad level. And what is the brain actually doing? What are these different parts of the brain actually doing in this machine? Why do we need these parts? What are the constraints and what are the pressures that require this particular architecture? And it's a very different kind of perspective than you might typically get in standard in a neuroscience lecture. Not going to be necessarily, although Mr. Coward's approach certainly goes down to the neural level, we're not necessarily going to be jumping in all the way down to dendritic spines and chemical signaling, although of course the brain is made of those things. But really zooming out to some extent and thinking about what is the role of the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, the cortex, what are they doing and why are they necessary in the kind of structure that we see. So this class is to some extent about how to think about modeling brains in such a way that we can incorporate the models into experiments in for example, in simulated environments. And so very honored to have Mr. Coward here to explain some of his perspective on this question. And I'd love for students to be thinking about how you could turn some of these ideas into an experiment in a virtual agent, for example, in a simulation. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mr. Coward to present his lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I may need a bit of help to get some slides on the screen. Good. Okay. Well, if I can, I think where I'm coming from is emphasizing the importance of a system approach to understanding how the brain generates cognition. And essentially that's the same as we need a system approach to understanding the design of a computer. And one starting point is that in a computer, you can't point to any one printed circuit assembly and say, oh, that's where word processing is performed, or that's where my web browser is supported. And so any one application needs processes that are performed by all sorts of different parts of the computer, like CPU, memory, and so on. And at a very detailed level, at different times, even just one transistor can be involved in multiple different applications. And in the same way, in the brain, any cognitive process uses multiple different anatomical structures, and any one anatomical structure supports lots of different cognitive processes. So it's actually quite misleading, in my view, to try to look at one anatomical structure as the site of any particular cognitive process. The brain is a system. And the second point is to emphasize that although cognitive processes are supported by neuron activity, neurons don't actually know about anything about cognition. The only information a neuron can access is whether its inputs are active or not. So what I want to do is to discuss how this works, especially for one major subsystem of the brain, the basal ganglia in this case. But at a very high level, both brains and computers have to detect conditions and the information available to them and associate different conditions with different behaviors. The big difference is that in computers, the conditions are specified by the designer and they can be associated with unambiguous commands to perform specific behaviors. And we generally call those instructions in the computer. But in the brain, the conditions are defined heuristically. And the consequence of that is they can only recommend behaviors. And generally, they can't command behaviors. And in the brain, the cortex does the heuristic definition of conditions, and we call those conditions receptive fields of pyramidal neurons. And in the subcortical structures, receptive field detections by the cortex are interpreted as behavioral recommendations. And each detection recommends a range of different behaviors, and each of those recommendations has a different weight. And the subcortical structures determine which behavior has the largest total weight across all the receptive fields that are currently being detected and influence it. So in a bit more detail, this is the overall architecture, the high-level architecture of the brain, and I've illustrated some substructures of the major subsystems. Now, one major problem for the brain is that cortical receptive fields are associated with a range of recommendations. But receptive fields change over time because they're defined heuristically. But if a receptive field changes, the behavioral recommendations already associated with it may not be completely valid. So you have to manage changes very carefully to minimize any loss of validity. And that management is carried out by the hippocampal system. Now, the amygdala, different structure, detects receptive fields that recommend very general types of behavior. And let's suppose the brain is in a threatening situation, and an appropriate response could be some aggressive behavior. Receptive fields in the amygdala are detected that correlate with the presence of a threat. But those fields don't recommend any specific aggressive behavior. They encourage other cortical areas to detect receptive fields that do recommend specific aggressive behaviors. And what happens is we experience the presence of all these recommendation strengths as a feeling of anger. And in general, different emotions are the subjective experience of different general behavioral priorities being placed on the brain, the presence of substantial recommendation strength in favor of a type of behavior. Another example is that the subjective experience of strong recommendation strength in favor of avoidance behaviors is, we label that experience fear. Now, the basal ganglia is the key place that gets receptive field detections from the cortex, interprets each detection as a range of behavioral recommendations, and then selects and implements the most strongly recommended behavior. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Now, many behaviors are actually implemented by releases of receptive field detections, either into the cortex, between cortical areas, or out of the cortex to drive motor movements. And the thalamus implements those released behaviors under the control of the basal ganglia. And sometimes the precise timing of an information release is essential, mainly in the case of changes to receptive fields. And in this case, the basal forebrain manages the timing. Now, the cerebellum is a special purpose structure. The problem it addresses is that determining the behavior with the largest recommendation strength by the basal ganglia takes a bit of time. And there may be survival benefit in acting a lot faster. And the way the brain speeds up responses exploits the fact that there are sequences of behaviors that are often used in the same order, like the sequences of muscle movements we use for walking or riding a bicycle or speaking words and phrases that we often use. So to increase the speed with which these sequences are carried out, they're recorded in the cerebellum. And the sequences are selected as a whole by the basal ganglia and then carried out as a whole by the cerebellum. And that avoids the time to select each individual behavior in the sequence. Now, because learning in the cerebellum is limited to the timing of already learned sequences, the cerebellum develops receptive fields that, unlike the cortex, actually correspond with commands to perform behaviors. But the negative of that is that the cerebellum can't change any behaviors or the order in which they're performed. If you want to make changes like that, control has to go back to the basal ganglia. So what I want to do now is to say a bit more about specifically the basal ganglia and maybe work my way down towards the neuron level. So basically, the question is, what does how does behavior selection, what functions does it have to perform? And you can break down the functions into various different aspects. There's the basic functions I've already talked about, a selection of behavior. But it's also important that most of the time, a behavior is actually selected. In other words, the system doesn't lock up. But it's also important that the system doesn't try to select two incompatible behaviors at the same time, like trying to move the same arm in two different directions at once. And another function is that in normal circumstances, sometimes there may not be any strong recommendation strength in favor of any behavior. But it's important to try something if the brain is going to learn. So another function is to encourage behaviors in novel situations. And in order to benefit from experience, if the results of a behavior are good, the recommendation weights that generated it should often be increased, and vice versa, of course. And on the other hand, another factor that I may not discuss in great detail, but it is important that as the weights change, one receptive field doesn't get a huge recommendation weight in favor of just one behavior. For example, if some behavior was frequently needed and generally successful, and one receptive field was detected fairly often, then if every time the recommendation weight of that field was increased, that could result in the behavior being selected every time that field was detected, even when some other behavior was appropriate. So it would distort the selection process. So there is a need to limit the growth of recommendation weights. But what I want to do now is look at how the neurons and connectivity of the basal ganglia achieve these kinds of functions. And this is the circuitry of the basal ganglia that does all these functions. The rectangular boxes are different nuclei in the basal ganglia, and I've labeled them with acronyms, and that's convention. And part of the reason is that most of them were originally given Latin names based on their visual experience, and they're actually quite hard to distinguish visually. And sometimes two nuclei were initially thought to be the same, and in one case, parts of two different nuclei were actually found to be one nucleus. So the actual names have become rather complex, and those are the names if you really want to know. But I'll tend to use acronyms. And in the diagram, a red line indicates that the connectivity between the neurons of the two nuclei is inhibitory, usually the neurotransmitter GABA. Green indicates an excitatory connectivity using glutamate, and blue indicates a somewhat more complex modulatory connection that uses the neurotransmitter dopamine. So the nucleus that gets most of the input from the cortex is called the striatum. And in the striatum, there's a matrix of neurons made up of two populations called D1 and D2. And the neurons in those two populations are actually quite similar. The main difference is that they respond differently to the neurotransmitter dopamine. And as the level of dopamine in the striatum increases, the D1 neurons become more active and the D1 neurons a bit less active. So essentially, the dopamine regulates the relative activity of the two populations. Now, in addition, there are patches of neurons located within the matrix, in patches inside the matrix. Now, the D1 and D2 neurons target a nucleus called the GPI-SNR. And the D1 neurons target the GPI-SNR neurons directly and inhibit them. The D2 neurons target the GPI-SNR neurons indirectly via a couple of intermediate nuclei, and as a result, the D2 neuron activity actually results in excitation of the GPI-SNR neurons. And neurons in both the matrix of the striatum and in the GPI-SNR actually correspond with individual behaviors. And I don't know if I mentioned that one example observed in a rat is that there are neurons that correspond with moving one limb in one specific direction. So it's very, very, very specific correspondence. So another key nucleus is the midbrain dopamine neurons, so the MDN, that targets the striatum. Now, the dopamine neurons fire in two different modes depending on their inputs. In one mode, the neuron fires steadily at about 4 spikes per second. And in the other, the neuron produces a short burst of spikes. And these two modes have different functions. The 4 spikes per second, the constant tonal 4 spikes per second, is regulated by inputs from the GPI-SNR. And those inputs actually determine how many of the MDN neurons are actually firing in that mode. The neurons in the patches of the striatum target the MDN, and some neurons in the patches can actually trigger burst firing of dopamine neurons, and other neurons in the patches can actually briefly reduce the number of dopamine neurons firing in the tonal mode. So there's two different types of effect. Now, in fact, the neurons in the patches correspond with reward behaviors. They increase or decrease the recommendation strengths that resulted in recent behaviors. Okay, so how does all this connectivity actually implement the functions of behavior selection? So a striatal neuron gets one input from each of a very large number of different cortical pyramidal neurons, and it interprets any active input as a recommendation in favor of its behavior. Now, the weight of the synapse from the cortical neuron onto the striatal neuron is the recommendation weight of the receptive field of that cortical neuron in favor of behavior corresponding with the striatal neuron. Now, neurons in the D1 population each determine the total weight in favor of their corresponding behavior and communicate that total weight to the GPI-SNR over the direct path. Neurons in the D2 population also correspond with one behavior, but they interpret their cortical inputs as recommendations against any behavior except their own, and they communicate the total weights to the GPI-SNR over the indirect path. Now, as I mentioned, the neurons in the GPI-SNR correspond with individual behaviors, so the D1 neurons target neurons corresponding with their own behavior, and the D2 neurons target GPI-SNR neurons corresponding with every behavior except their own. So there's a competition within the GPI-SNR to determine the most strongly recommended behavior. Now, in a bit more detail, the GPI-SNR neurons actually fire constantly in the absence of any input. And their constant firing inhibits the thalamus, which prevents the corresponding behavior from happening. Now, the D1 outputs are inhibitive, so they actually inhibit the neuron in the GPI-SNR corresponding with their behavior, so they decrease the amount of signal going to the thalamus, so they actually increase the chance of their behavior being selected. Now, the D2 outputs are also inhibitive, but via those two intermediate nuclei, they actually excite the GPI-SNR neurons, and then those neurons correspond with behaviors other than their own. So they reduce the chance of those behaviors being selected. So the competition within the GPI-SNR results in the neurons corresponding with the most strongly recommended behavior dropping their activity. And that allows the thalamus to implement the recommended behavior. Now, in general, as I mentioned earlier, the brain needs to select a behavior in most situations, but not select two incompatible behaviors. So it needs to make sure that this competition process ends up with one, but not more than one behavior. And if no behavior is being selected, then all the neurons in the GPI-SNR are going to be firing strongly. So the total activity in the GPI-SNR will be fairly high. On the other hand, if more than one behavior is being selected, the total activity in the GPI-SNR is going to be a bit low. And that total activity is communicated to the midbrain dopamine neurons. And if the activity is high, implying that no behavior is being selected, the number of dopamine neurons firing in the steady 4 spikes per second mode increases, which increases the level of the background dopamine in the striatum. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a higher dopamine level increases the activity of the D1 neurons and decreases the D2. Now, since the D2 encourage behaviors, the increase in dopamine concentration increases the chance of a selection, which is correcting for the situation when no behavior is being selected. Now, on the other hand, if the total activity in the GPI-SNR is too low, that implies that more than one behavior is in danger of being selected, and the number of dopamine neurons firing in that steady mode decreases. That affects the dopamine concentration in the striatum, but in the other direction. So that increases the activity of D2 relative to D1. And since the D2 neurons recommend against behaviors, that decreases the chance of a selection. So there's basically a regulation via the dopamine neurons to ensure that generally one behavior is selected, but not multiple incompatible behaviors. Now, if the receptive fields detected by the cortex have large recommendation strength in favor of a positive reward, then a patch striatal neuron fires. And that triggers burst firing of dopamine neurons that target back to the striatum. And that burst firing results in a long-term increase to the recommendation rates that generated the recently selected behaviors. In other words, the striatal matrix neurons correspond with recently selected behavior. The the matrix neurons that correspond with the recently selected behavior will have recently fired because the behavior was selected, and the weights of the cortical inputs that cause them to fire are going to be increased. Now, on the other hand, if the cortical receptor fields are recommending a negative reward, then a different patch neuron fires, and that triggers a brief decrease in the number of dopamine neurons firing in the tonal mode, and that briefly drops the level of background dopamine, and in those circumstances, that decrease results in a long-term decrease in the recommendation weights in favor of the recently selected behaviors. So that's the process being used by the basal ganglia, and it's interesting to look at in novel situations as well. But there may not be any strongly recommended behavior, but it's important to try a behavior. And as part of its change management function, the hippocampus detects the presence of novelty. So in novel situations, there may not be any particularly strong behavior, but the hippocampus targets the striatum, encourages behavior activity of the D2 population, and basically increases the chance of some total recommendation weight being tipped over to enough to generate a behavior. Okay, so that's how the basal ganglia carries out some of those functions. And what I want to do briefly now is to point out how damage to the basal ganglia results in the observed cognitive deficits. And Parkinson's disease is well known. The most obvious symptoms are problems initiating voluntary motor movements. The movements become slower and eventually deteriorate into effectively paralysis. And there can also be some cognitive symptoms. In hemibalism, on the other hand, there are wild, uncontrollable flinging motions of the arms and legs that are inserted into whatever behavior was intended. Okay, so how does this work? Well, what am I doing? If we look at the basal ganglia circuitry that's affected, in the case of Parkinson's disease, the symptoms result from the death of dopamine neurons in the midbrain dopamine neurons structure. Now, if the neurons are dying, that's going to reduce the level of background dopamine in the striatum. And that's going to reduce the activity of the D1 neurons relative to the D2 neurons. So there's going to be an increased tendency for no behavior to be selected, which is basically what you observe in Parkinson's, difficulty in initiating voluntary behaviors. In the case of hemibalism, the symptoms are associated with damage to the subthalamic nucleus, which is one of those on the STN on that indirect path. Now, in that situation, the activity of the indirect pathway is going to be reduced, and therefore there's going to be an increase in the selection probability, probably selecting multiple incompatible behaviors. Now, when multiple incompatible behaviors are going to be selected, the resolution has to occur rather close to muscles. So, because you can't actually physically move an arm two different ways at the same time. So what you'll get is jerkiness, unexpected, irrelevant movements, which is what you observe in hemibalism. So the damage, you can understand how that specific damage to the basal ganglia system results in the symptoms that are found in human patients. So in general, though, receptive fields in different parts of the cortex are most effective for recommending different types of behavior. And you can identify different regions of the cortex that are most effective for recommending behaviors that differ on a spectrum from strategic to very detailed. And what I mean by that, for example, is that if you think about a musician playing in a concert, a strategic behavior will be selection of the time and place of the concert. And once that selection has been made, tactical behaviors will be to choose the pieces of music to be played. And once those selections have been made, specific behaviors could be where to stand on stage and what to say to the audience and so forth. And very detailed behaviors, of course, are the finger movements to produce the music. And the recommendations, these different strategic, tactical and specific recommendations, go to different parts of the striatum. There's a shell, what's called the shell of the ventral striatum at one end, across to the more dorsal end of the basal ganglia. So the recommendations go to different locations in the basal ganglia, in the striatum, sorry, and the different parts of the striatum determine the total recommendation strengths, communicate them to the GPI-SNR, And then the most strongly recommended behaviors are implemented by the thalamus into the cortex. So in fact, actually, multiple behaviors of different general types could be implemented at the same time because they don't interfere with each other. Okay, so there is an analogous pattern of connectivity involved in the selection of reward behaviors, which has some interesting characteristics. There are recommendations in favor of rewarding strategic, tactical, specific, or detailed behaviors. And they're made by those same different cortical regions, and different parts of the striatum, as before, determine the total recommendation weights, and the selections are implemented into the midbrain dopamine neurons. And then they go back to the striatum, which I indicated. I've just drawn the striatum twice because it makes it a little bit clearer. So they go back to the behaviors, the reward behaviors go back to the striatum, the changes to recommendation weights. Now, if you take the outputs from the shell, there's an interesting characteristic to this connectivity. The outputs from the shell target the ventral part of the midbrain dopamine neurons. It's sometimes called the VTA. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is that the part of the VTA that gets inputs from the shell actually targets back to the shell, but also part of the core. And in fact, the part of the midbrain dopamine neurons that is targeted by the core is actually targets back to the core, but also to part of the central striatum, and so on. So there's a kind of spiral of connectivity. Now, what's it doing? So to understand this circuitry, remember this is the circuitry that determines whether behaviors are going to, or the reward behaviors, the increases in recommendation weights. Let's think about how the brain actually determines when to reward strategic, tactical, detailed behaviors. And if you take the example of a musician, the musician example again, who's rewarded by vigorous applause at the end of a piece of music. Now, that reward is appropriate for rewarding the tactical behavior of choosing to play that piece of music at that place in time. On the other hand, the applause is not necessarily appropriate for rewarding every individual muscle movement and every mental process that led up to those muscle movements, because some of the muscle movements could have been better than average and some could have been worse than others. So what's the right way to reward all the finger movements? Well, when learning to play, a musician gets comments from a teacher, and receptive field detections, perhaps detected within those comments, can be used by the brain to recommend reward behaviors, even the rewards of relatively detailed finger movements. But a teacher can only go so far, and the musician's brain needs to progress well beyond the teacher's instructions and feedback. So let's suppose that the teacher has helped create in the musician's brain some initial recommendation weights to reward the very detailed behaviors. How can those recommendation weights be enhanced? And the key is that although vigorous applause after a piece of music may not be appropriate for rewarding every muscle movement, it does indicate that overall most of those movements were pretty good, which implies that the way those muscle movements are being rewarded is working fairly well. So although the applause cannot be used to reward every finger movement, it can be used to reward the way the finger movements are being rewarded. And in general, a strategic reward can reward strategic behaviors, and also the way in which tactical behaviors are being rewarded. A tactical reward can reward tactical behaviors, and also the way in which specific or detailed behaviors are being rewarded. And that's the reason for this offset in the pattern of connectivity. Strategic rewards reward recent strategic behaviors, but also the behaviors of rewarding more tactical behaviors, and so on. Okay, well, now I do want to drop down briefly to a neuron level, a rather simplified view of what's going on at the neuron level. This is a picture of what's called a medium spiny neuron in the striatum, and with an increased enlargement as you move to the right. And the close-up on the right shows that there are lots of spines that stick out from the trunk of one dendrite. And an input from a different cortical pyramidal neuron arrives at the tip of each one of those spines. And the key thing here is that the connection point, the synapse between the cortical neuron and the striatal neuron is isolated out on the spine. So this isolation allows changes to the weight of one synapse, in other words, changes to one recommendation weight, independent of all the others. And to give a very rough flavor of how these recommendation weight changes occur, this is a conceptual diagram of a glutamatergic synapse and a nearby dopamine synapse. Quite often, dopamine synapse is close to the glutamate synapses. And there's a central body or a soma, and in the soma, there's a nucleus that contains genetic information. There's a dendrite that sticks out from the body of the neuron, and you've got a spine that protrudes out from the dendrite with a synapse on the tip of the spine. And inputs from the pyramidal neuron arrive down the axon. And at the base of the dendritic spine, there are ribosomes that can synthesize molecules on the basis of genetic information that's obtained from the nucleus. So, in fact, the size of the synapse, and this is a somewhat simplified view, but the size of the synapse correlates with the strength of the synapse and therefore the size of the recommendation weight. And the size is actually maintained by structural proteins. The steady state size is determined by the rate at which actin, a molecule actin, that is the component that makes up the structural protein, the rate at which actin is synthesized at the ribosomes. So if the neuron fires, any synapses that have recently received an input from a pyramidal neuron slightly increase in size, but they revert back to the original size in about an hour. And that's a bit of a simplification of a very dynamic process. But within an hour, an input is received. If an input is received within the hour at a nearby dopamine synapse, the combination results in chemical processes that trigger transport of additional messenger RNA, the messenger RNA that codes for actin, out from the nucleus, and that drives long-term synthesis of actin at a higher rate. And that pushes the size of the synapse out long-term. So if you like, this is an example of how you could map a little part of the behavior selection function all the way down to chemical processes. And maybe briefly I can move right up back to the cognitive level again. Now, recommendation weights are assigned heuristically to cortical receptive fields. But to get a recommendation weight, a cortical neuron has to have a synapse onto the striatal neuron that corresponds with the behavior. So how does the brain decide which pyramidal neurons will target which striatal neurons? And actually, the same problem exists for cortical receptor fields. How does the brain decide which pyramidal neurons are connected to which other pyramidal neurons? Now, if the recommendation weight of an additional input is needed, or if an additional input to a pyramidal neuron is needed for that matter, the information driving the change is only available for a very short time. It's far too short generally to grow an axon branch and then create a synapse on the tip of the branch. So any synapses that are going to be needed have to be created in advance. So there have to be some provisional synapses, and of course the provisional synapse isn't guaranteed to be useful. So how can the brain make sure that provisional synapses are created that have a good chance of being useful, needed for recommendation weights or needed for receptive field definitions, and avoid wasting resources involved in creating large numbers of useless synapses? Now, the only information available to neurons is past temporal correlation activity. They just know that other neurons have fired. In other words, if two unconnected neurons have often been active in the past at the same time, a connection between them is much more likely to be useful. There's no point in connecting two neurons that are never active at the same time. So how can the brain establish connections likely to be useful in the future? Well, if the brain does a fast rerun of a sample of past experience, then neurons appropriate for being connected that are often active at the same time during the rerun, in other words, can be tagged, and then the connections can be grown. And because the recent past is likely to be a little bit better guide to the immediate future, the rerun should start with the most recent. But such a rerun is going to confuse the processing of current experience. So you need to take the brain offline for the rerun. So what does all that look like? Well, to create the needed provisional connectivity, brains are regularly taken offline in sleep, they perform a fast rerun of selections of past experience, and we call that rerun dreaming. And there's probably a bias in favor of selections that included rather more novel experiences. And early in the rerun, in the sleep period, the brain focuses on more recent experiences, later in sleep, more distant experiences. And of course, the fast rerun results in all sorts of unusual cross connections. So the subjective experience can be a little bizarre, but the process is essentially configuring resources appropriate for learning in the future. And of course, if that's the purpose, recording dream experiences would be a waste of the resources. And in general, therefore, we don't remember dreams. So at that final point, I've gone back up from some neurons, back up to subjective experience. But I think the key thing here in summary is that understanding cognition requires us to think about the brain as a system made up of a huge number of neurons, where neurons don't know anything about cognition, but their combined activity actually generates cognition. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Definitely want to give a little time for any questions that folks might have. I believe there's a marathon of events. There's a meeting with students at 2:30. Well, we may have more time than I thought, but I'm sure people do have questions, so they're just feeling shy. I would. It's something we talked about a little bit. We touched upon a little bit earlier, but sort of these. The recommendations of behaviors themselves are kind of nested and hierarchical, and I'm wondering, in your model, how do you, you've talked about recommendations and the idea of competing recommendations, multiple recommendations, and within any recommendation, there's going to be multiple behaviors that are associated with it, kind of nested. How does one start to even think about the problem of the hierarchy? My recommendation right now is to go get some lunch. Well, in order to get some lunch, I have to first get up out of my seat. I also have to walk out of the room, and all of these, and I have to take the next step. And each kind of behavior is made up of many, many different behaviors. And is that is there a way to think about at what level the initial recommendation happens, and then that cascades to all of the associated behaviors that go with that? How does one grapple with this sort of multiplicity of possible recommended behaviors?
Well, yeah, I think that actually that we can view that in terms of the division into strategic, tactical, specific, and detailed behaviors. That I think, let's say you're in a situation and you've got it's a fairly complex situation, and there are various recommendations like asking a question or going and getting lunch or whatever else. And if you like, there are receptive fields detected in response to the very complex situation, incorporating information from all different aspects of the situation. And they have different recommendation strengths in favor of food-seeking behavior or question behavior and so forth. And those recommendations, the receptive fields have these recommendations, and there's a competition process to select one of the behaviors. And let's say it might be food-seeking behavior. So the strategic behavior of going and looking for something to eat has been selected. And what then happens is that there are some receptive fields in the very complex level that recommended that behavior. And if that behavior is accepted, the receptive fields that recommended it are then released to another cortical area that recommends different tactical behaviors, more specific, sort of, shall I go towards the restaurant? Should I go towards my office where there's some sandwich in my desk, and so on and so forth? And then so you get a hierarchy of if you select one of those, then that may some of the receptive fields have most of the recommendation strength in favor of that option, which is say, going to the restaurant. And because they are the ones that are released, they will recommend specific motor behaviors that lead to you going to the restaurant. So there's a kind of hierarchy, and reflected in the fact that different cortical areas are most effective discriminating between different types of circumstances, and therefore they have different recommendation strengths, but the circumstances they detect are influenced by their inputs. And so a choice of strategic behavior, one strategic behavior, will influence the kind of receptive fields that recommend tactical behaviors.
Thank you.
I have a question, Dr. Coward. Thank you for the talk. It was great. I have a question about, so you're saying, talking about behaviors, the ones we just talked about are more plant behaviors. I'm particularly interested in sports and more subconscious behaviors that, for example, receiving a tennis serve, like you don't have enough time to plan for it, but it's all happening subconscious. How would you propose that type of behavior manifests itself or emerges?
Well, I think that if you take the tennis example, that if you're the tennis player, then you're on the court and you've got a lot of sensory inputs over a period of time. And some parts of your brain are detecting receptive field in response to very complex circumstances, which include the combination of your position on the court, your opponent's position on the court, the body language of your opponent, your own feeling, how your body feels, a little bit of information about what has happened in the recent past. And those, if you like, are very general receptive fields that recommend strategic behaviors. Now, let's say that now different strategic behaviors might be how you're going to, where you're going to stand on the court to serve, say it's your serve, where you're going to stand on the court. And if one strategic behavior is accepted, then that goes on to releases receptive fields that drive further receptive field detections that recommend different, more specific behaviors. So in a sense, there's sort of but it's all based on the various receptive field detections that can recommend on different levels. I don't know whether that's very. Tennis is not my sport. If I use a slightly different example, if you take soccer, which actually I use as an example in the later talk, but if you have a soccer player, they're going to have a strategic behavior choice is whether to play defense, attack, or midfield. And once you've made one of those choices, then a tactical choice might be to move to a certain spot on the playing field. And then once you've made that decision, a more detailed choice might be to tackle one particular player. And then an even more specific choice would be the body movements to make the tackle. But basically what's happening then is that the strategic choice is recommended by very general receptive field detections within the information about the field as a whole and the recent history on the field and recent playing experience. And they can recommend, let's say they recommend defensive behavior, if that's the predominant recommendation, then the receptive fields that recommended that defensive behavior are released to an area that can recommend more specific behaviors like moving to different parts of the field. So the acceptance of the strategic behavior means that the receptive fields detected will recommend defensive type movements on the field. And then acceptance of the defense, and one of those is picked, go to that particular location. And having accepted that behavior, then those receptive fields that recommended it are released, and they result in receptive field detections that recommend the body movements to go to that position. So you get a hierarchy of behavior selection, if you like. Now, of course, it can be bypassed, but you may have a certain input that triggers you to do something immediately without going through that process. But generally speaking, that's the way we can use experience to pick behaviors.
Yeah, because that's a great explanation. I was thinking about it in terms of, I don't know if you heard of James Gibson and his ecological dynamics approach, mm-hmm. and where he basically proposes that how we perform and how we recognize visual cognition and other cognition is not in information-based form that where we get input in and output through action, but it's all in with the affordances, how it relates to our body. And I'm trying to figure out how to take your approach and kind of incorporate it with that one. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his approach at all.
Not really, but so are you saying how do you incorporate body information into this?
Yes, basically because James Gibson proposes that there is no process where we, let's say, get in visual information as input, then have some type of decision maker that looks at the weights of information and then output action. So his approach is basically proposes that all this happens dynamically to where the environment, the person perceives affordances from the environment and basically acts in order to perceive more affordances, as well as what's the word? Acts on what the environment basically lets them do. So it's very specific to the individual as well as the situation that the environment presents and the goals that the person has. So all these are kind of intertwined. It's not going from one to the next, making a decision and then creating output, but it's all in one encompassing structure.
Yeah, well, there's not necessarily as much difference as from my position as might appear in that, because remember that the behavior selections that I'm describing, really all that's happening is that neuron activity is being released from one area to another. So those are the behaviors. And so in that sense, it's not that there's necessarily a sequence of choices at the, in a sense, calling it strategic and tactical is good for purpose of explanation, but really all that's happening is that neurons activity has been released between cortical areas. So it's not that there's a sequence of decisions in a cognitive sense. You can view them as sort of cognitive decisions, but really all that's happening is receptive field release detections are being released. So, and for example, if you're constantly getting input from your body, proprioceptic sense, or from the positions of muscles, the position of limbs and so forth, and there are receptive fields that are detected within the body positions. And those can have recommendation strengths in favor of doing things. And sometimes they may have a strong recommendation strength, and that may be much larger than any recommendation strength coming from receptive fields detected within the circumstances. So really there can be all sorts of shortcuts, in other words. And but I think that I'm trying to avoid, as far as possible, putting too strong a cognitive label on things, because, as I say, really all that's happening is that you've got neuron activity, and ultimately the neuron activity drives muscles, and you get behaviors. But and you can label some of the intermediate processes, but essentially all that's happening is that neurons are active.
Thank you for that explanation. I don't want to monopolize the time. I have so many more questions, but thank you so much.
I have a quick question. Hello?
Yes.
Is my voice clear?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to ask you about the architecture where you discussed about the Parkinson's disease and Hannibalism or
Yes.
something like that.
Yes.
So I am curious that you said that when there is a selection of multiple behavioral action, then there is a feedback happens through the MDN, and that kind of disrupts the D1 and dopamine 1 and dopamine 2 pathways that kind of help in selection of more specific action. So I'm kind of curious to know that because brain is plastic, it has a lot of plasticity to it. So when there is like STN has like a reduced activity, in that situation, why does this feedback through MDN cannot help? Or why is it not like effective in stopping when there is multiple selection of action happening during Hannibalism?
Well, I'm sure it does to some degree. And in fact, if going the other way, in fact, when dopamine neurons die, there is a lot of ability to just to respond, maintain homeostasis, if you like. The level of background dopamine in the striatum stays the same because a higher proportion of the neurons fire, and so it maintains it for quite a while. I think that the key thing is that there are these two mechanisms to try to maintain, two routes to try to maintain the balance, or the dopamine balance. And if something gets thrown off, then maybe it won't fail every time, but it does fail sometimes. It's not quite a stable state.
Okay.
And if you like, in hemibalism, you don't, every motion, if it was really bad, then you'd be jerking all over the place. But it is possible to make movements, but occasionally it's more likely that you'll get two movements and something will flip. So it's, as I say, it's not a black and white thing. It's just that the system is balanced, and if something goes wrong on one side, occasionally you get things that flip out. Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank
It
you.
looks like somebody has a question on the chat. I don't know if they want to jump in and ask it or...
Yeah, Alex actually said that his mic isn't working, so he said I could field the question for him. So he was asking, at what point in human ontogenesis does this circuit become operational? Is it active prenatally? And I think we were talking about just in general, the behavior recommendation subsystem, that entire circuit.
Oh, whoa. I am afraid that's going to be outside my competence. Yeah. No, I don't.
I guess more broadly, developmentally, do you see that there are certain things that come online at specific stages of development? Is that really part of your proposal, or is that left to the developmentalist?
I think that I think I'm better say it's left to the developmentalist. I've not looked at that other in very general terms. I think that there are some things that are pre-wired, or about genetic bias that establishes the wiring, and at some point during development that has to take place. Things like definition of receptive fields that correlate with somebody smiling, or because that's we appear to be able to recognize that even in small children. But other than that very general comment, I really can't address the development. Sorry.
Can you comment on finding this analogous architecture in other systems? At one point you mentioned like a bird brain, and it doesn't have the same layers, but there's sort of these different regions that are analogous.
Yeah. I think the bird brain doesn't have it does appear to have a separation between a cortex. It's not quite the same, but judging by the connectivity in the neuron types, there is a cortex equivalent in the bird brain, and there's certainly a basal ganglia equivalent, and there's a hippocampus equivalent, even in the bird brain. It's a very general form, and basically the excitatory neurons that indicate receptive fields, and the inhibition circuitry that's characteristic of the basal ganglia. That separation is clear in the bird brain. And the connectivity that the senses go into the excitatory side. So and I think that even more primitive things, even I think the octopus brain has something similar.
I have a quick question. Real quick. I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to try to describe this as best as I can. This is not my level of expertise as far as vocabulary. But going back to the Parkinson's with the damage to the basal ganglia, from a systems architecture perspective, you mentioned something about there are some breakdown and some cognition when this how can I say with Parkinson's in general, from my perspective, I'm looking at more seeing physical elements. Okay, but you did mention that from that breakdown of that system, there are some cognition issues that have been seen. Mm-hmm. So if you look at it as a layer from the biology or the system breaking down itself, that's causing the physical visual physical issues per se.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever see has it ever been known as far as the motor system breakdown? Is a cognition of that still viable, or is it totally reliant on the actual architecture of the system? Is there a one-to-one connection as far as it degenerate, cognition becomes something less of, or is it something that we just can't measure per se?
Well, I think that I think what's happened. One separation here, one difference here is that I think I mentioned that you've got the organization of the basal ganglia from ventral end to dorsal end, and that the dorsal end, it's much more muscle movement, and it's much more, if you like, strategic at the ventral end. And you've got the same structure in the midbrain dopamine neurons. You've got one end interfaces with the more strategic end of the basal ganglia, and the other end interfaces with the more detailed end, the more motor end of the striatum. So I think what's, if you like, if you get death of the dopamine neurons at the dorsal end of the midbrain dopamine, then you'll get more physical symptoms. And if you get death of dopamine neurons in the more ventral end, then you'll get more cognitive symptoms. So it depends on where the neurons are dying. But also, I think that sometimes it may be because the cognitive things are there may be other ways of doing things in the cognitive area, but different ways of getting at the same thing. So sometimes there could be workarounds, despite the fact that although your thinking slows down, perhaps if there's going to be death of neurons in the dopamine neurons in those more ventral areas. So I think it's partly the fact that the death starts off at the dorsal end, and you get less, but it does eventually work its way along, and you get a stronger effect. But of course, there's also the question of at what point would the patient be alive if certain things break down.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was wondering. How organized a system, our percentage, just to look at a percentage number, what's the percentage of a system as far as working normal, which could be, mean a lot of things, to have an efficient cognition, and then what's that breakdown as far as that. But again, sometimes, like you said, if there are other ways to do it, what makes that decision, so again, correct.
Yeah, well, in a sense, what makes the decision is simply which neurons are still there, and or which are still viable. And if there are some neurons that are still alive that influence certain areas of the striatum that correspond with certain behaviors, then those behaviors can end up still being selected. So maybe the release between those two cortical areas is still working fairly well, but the release between these two cortical areas is no longer working effectively. So depending on exactly what damage has taken place, it may be possible to work around things by using a different kind of release.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to call it because we're eating into the time that is allocated to the graduate neuroscience training program students. Some of them are here and will just be staying on. I think it's important for students to have a little bit of time where faculty maybe step out of the room, which I'm going to do, so that you guys can talk about graduate student stuff. And as you're just sitting out on your perhaps on your academic path and journey, it's wonderful to have an opportunity to talk to somebody who has a broad perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and leave, and this Zoom meeting should remain active, I believe, until I'm going to say 3:30.
It's until 3:15.
3:15. Okay, so that'll kind of put a hard stop on and let our poor speaker have a moment to collect his thoughts before the 4 o'clock. talk. So I will leave it to you guys. Whoever's anybody's welcome to stay. I'm just go ahead and stay.
Dr. Barinholtz,
Yeah.
if you need to join the seminar link that you got your personal link by at least 10 till,
Okay.
and I will talk to you there, and I'll start him there later with Jan, okay?
Okay, perfect.
And then the GNTP students, you can all stay in. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll see you all later.
Bye,
Thank you.
Dr. Hahn.
Thanks, y'all.
I have to take a call, but I had such a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we stay in touch.
Very good. I hope so too.
Mr. Coward, I had a question. I know you've heard a lot from me today, so I'm going to try not to captivate the meeting in case there's some other students that want to ask questions. I did, actually, we did host a journal club about your paper, the resource implications of resource conservation and conscious machines last week. And one of the questions that came up that was really popular amongst the discussion there was your critique for the global workspace theory, because it seems like a lot of computational scientists here, like Yoshio Bengio and Murray Shanahan, they're interested in implementing global workspace. And I'm just not sure if they've actually what's the discrepancy between your architecture and global workspace, and also where do you see being implemented where this really starts to matter? As far as a software design perspective, where does it really matter?
Oh, okay. Well, yes. I think that, how do you say? I think that with the global workspace, what's happening is that, how can I put it? Let me give a different example. Let's suppose that I wanted to implement a word processing program. Now, I know that the word processing program has a number of features. The ability to type and to copy and paste and so forth. Now, given those features, I could try to build a system with those features. Now, the problem would be that, let's say I could implement a little piece that did a copy and paste function, another little piece that did the typing function, another little piece that, or whatever. Now, the thing is that if I try to implement it that way, basically implementing the features without taking any consideration for what the computer is doing, what the system is doing, then I will probably end up implementing things very inefficiently in terms of the number of transistors I'll need. And yeah, I could certainly get something to work, but it would just be a very inefficient implementation. And the other thing would be that if I did that specific implementation, it might turn out to be quite awkward, for example, to move information across from the word processing program into some an email program, let's say. Because I've implemented them very much in terms of making those features work without thinking about the mechanisms too much. And I think that that's probably, I think that given enough resources, you could probably get a system that will mimic human consciousness, perhaps using the global workspace. But it won't really tell you how the brain does anything because it's not taking account of the processes actually available at the more detailed level. And another thing is that it isn't necessarily, the system has to bootstrap itself. Our consciousness bootstraps itself. And I think that the issue there would also be, how would the global workspace system bootstrap itself from experience? And so it's really issues of that kind.
Yeah, so it's not just enough for, because in global workspace theory, because that's what I presented that as an argument, because you wrote that really well in your paper as well in the discussion, and the counter argument was that there's just these long range connections between the gray and white matter that are connecting like basically superhighways connecting different regions and submodules. So is your argument there that that's really just not enough to bootstrap the tons of information that we hold in our different neural cascades?
Well, you say no, not necessarily. It's sort of I think that the consciousness does depend on these connections between between different areas. But I think it's also in my view, it's a learned behavior that therefore it has to have the right experience, and the right experience, I just say, is works well with the predefined wiring to produce the kind of phenomena of consciousness. And maybe that's another factor that I think that some consciousness there's happy accidents in that sometimes it can use capabilities that have been developed for other purposes, which and because of the architecture of the brain, it's possible to use those happy accidents. I think, for example, the fact that we learn speech, I think speech is critical for maintaining the kind of consciousness that we experience, and they work well together because of the wiring of the brain and the architecture of the brain. Now you can build that into your model after the fact, but I think that if you want to understand the brain, you have to start with the way the brain is and recognize that this is its initial connectivity, and this is how that connectivity has been evolved by experience to produce the phenomenon.
Thank you. I think that clears it up quite a bit.
Well, feel free to disagree.
I agree with you that this, I think one thing that I'm really interested in that's been left out largely is how, no one's talking about it. There's a couple people in artificial life community that talk about open-endedness, but nobody's really talking about how your brain has to evolve to the level of complexity that you're in as an organism. So if your environment isn't requiring and demanding that you do this type of learning, then it's not going to happen in your brain, and vice versa. Your brain isn't going to be able to, it's like this feedback cycle that's happening between, signal manipulation that the organism can do based on learning and the actual complexity of the environment. So I think I would tend to agree with your architecture here that it's that learning of the mapping of connections that's more important than just kind of like brute forcing some slightly more ad hoc version of what could make consciousness.
Yeah, I think that actually there is a theory which I'm very sympathetic towards, is that at least our self-awareness, the belief that this actually only emerged about 2,500 years ago. And before that, our mental architecture, if you like, was quite different. And in other words, it was a learned behavior. Now, the thing that brought that up was your comment that it depends on the environment you're in. And the argument being that before about 500 BC, you had very hierarchical societies that were isolated from each other, and that around about 2,500 years ago, these societies began to interact strongly and conquer each other and so forth. And it was that radical change in human environment from a very hierarchical society to a society that was much more likely to encounter influential foreigners and so forth, that precipitated a change in mental architecture, and which we can often label self-awareness. So really, I'm saying that the consciousness, my belief is consciousness is learned, or self-awareness is learned, and it really, the way it's learned depends on the environment you're brought up in.
Super fascinating. If I could just ask one more quick question, and then I promise the other students I'll shut up. I was saying earlier, I really love your pattern thinking book, and I know it's like a much older book for you and you've moved on for it, but seriously, I think it was really written beautifully. And the one question I'm really like confronted with here is in later chapters, you outline how to implement some of this stuff in, for Pascal now, or, Pascal language or whatever. And what was ever done with that? Did anything become of that? I couldn't find like any actual reports of.
I think that no, they're not. I think that what I was getting at there, I think, if I remember rightly, is that I think you could you could generate hardware to perform the functions of neurons very efficiently, and basically, the key thing there is that like you say, the neurons have a lot of connectivity, and what you could do is rather than, and it's dynamic connectivity. In other words, the neurons acquire connections onto each other, and sometimes they cut off connections. So and that's very hard to do in a physical system. But on the other hand, the way you can get around that, or the way you can do something equivalent, is using time domain multiplexing, basically. That you essentially you more or less connect everything to everything, because you have and the reason you can do that is because your processing speeds are much higher for a computer. So you can actually squeeze in lots of information into a single bus. So that was really and that would have required special purpose silicon and so on, which was never done, because my interest is more being able to simulate limited pieces and seeing if they in fact give the adequate, rather than building a system to do anything. I'm interested in how the brain does certain things. So I've done simulations of the hippocampal system and so forth in terms of neurons, but I've never really attempted any kind of artificial intelligence system.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm going to break up for just a second, Dr. Coward. The GNTP students that are all in the meeting now, please join with your audio and your video on. And we're going to have you introduce yourself really quick. And then if each one of you have a question, we can do that. And we should have, if you were a GNTP student that I didn't invite, but you were with the class, you're welcome to stay also. And whoever has a question first that hasn't talked, go ahead, introduce yourself. And Dr. Coward, these are all of our neuroscience program students that were brought in by the Brain Institute. They came in, and in their first year, they rotated in 3 labs. And then many of these students are in their 3rd year, 2nd year. We have a variety of them. The first year after their rotation, then they're in their final lab now. And I'm going to let them each introduce themselves real quick to you. And if you have any questions, go ahead and I'll drop back out. Thank you.
I guess I'll start if no one else wants to. I don't have working video at the moment, but I think you guys can hear me. Is that correct? Can I get a nod? Or
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi, it's a pleasure to meet with you. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for doing a marathon. Much appreciated. My name is Steven. I'm a first-year GNTP student, and I'm still selecting my PhD program. I think I'll wait till after introductions to do my question, but I have a question if you don't mind.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Claudius. I'm also a first-year GNTP student, and like I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in how you make decisions, sports, especially in invasion sports like soccer, football, basketball, where there's multiple players. And so that's why your research and your paper has been very interesting to me. I tried to sign up for one of your courses, but I had trouble signing in, so maybe at the end you can let me know how I can get in that course. For some reason, it didn't work with my email.
Oh, okay.
The question I had, another question I had was, do you believe that every behavior that we display, so let's say in a soccer game, that it is somehow stored in our brain somewhere, or do you think there's room for direct perception where we just perceive something and we act on it without having a real representation of that movement stored somewhere in our brain, but it kind of emerges out of the situation instead of being a response to something that is stored?
Okay. Now, should I answer that question now, or should we introduce everybody and I come back? I made a note of that.
Do you want to turn off your share screen so you'll be able to see everyone?
Oh.
Just you could just stop your share screen.
Okay. Can I? Oh, here we are.
Down
Stop
at the very
there.
bottom there. There you go.
Actually, it's right at the top of another screen.
There you go. Now you can see everyone. Perfect. And I'll just go back out and you can continue with the students. Thanks, guys.
Okay. So, so should I answer that question or should I?
This is up to the other people. I don't know. If
Actually, yeah. Can you? It'd be great if you could answer questions. We only have about 15 minutes, so introductions might not be useful.
Okay. Well, yeah. So as far as the our movement stored, I think that if you like, what's happening here is that ultimately, at a very detailed level, we have muscle movements. You twitch a muscle, and I think those are fixed, more or less. And what we can do is put together combinations and sequences of those. And I think that a lot of the time we construct sequences that we often use, and those are relatively fixed, and we can do those fairly quickly. But then, if you like, I think what you've got though is that you can have the cortex can detect receptor fields on all sorts of different levels, and the cortex can recommend ultimately can recommend muscle twitches, or can recommend calling up some pre-programmed sequence, or even some combination of sequences. So if you like, for the purposes of speed, you probably most of the time call on pre-programmed sequences, but you can mix and match. So you can call up that sequence and then that sequence and then that sequence, which means when you're moving on the soccer field, you're calling up sequences, but so you're making decisions about which combinations to use, but you aren't actually deciding on new combinations of muscle movements. But on the other hand, in training, you may well end up coming out with a new combination of muscle movements, and then that combination becomes one you can call up later on. I think that I don't know if you're here for. I did make another point earlier today that I think the thing that's going on here is that if you've got the cortex recommending things, you've got the basal ganglia deciding what's the strongest recommendation, and that takes time. The processing, the neurons acting in sequence, it takes a certain amount of time. And in a soccer game or in a lot of things, the brain doesn't have that time if you can avoid it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what happens then is that I think the sequences that are developed are the sequences of behaviors are stored in the cerebellum. And that means that the brain the basal ganglia can select a sequence and then just run the sequence without looking at each individual behavior, whether that's appropriate next. And that's why, however, a lot of time is saved in behaviors. So
you believe it's in the cerebellum where you have those fixed behaviors that are not just like walking or riding a bike, which, I mean, that's basically the same every time you do it. But the argument within the skill acquisition community and the people who kind of propose the ecological dynamics from James Gibson, they say that that in sports you'll never see the same situation twice, and you'll never perform the same movement twice. So even the simple movement, not simple, but it's a complex movement, but like even throwing a pitch in baseball, it might look similar. You never will perform that same movement twice. So that's why they argue that there's no internal representation of movement, but there is some type of direct perception, and the environment and the person, their physical representation at that time will determine the movement, and there is no program run by an internal mechanism. So
I'm not sure. It depends on how finely you slice up the behaviors. But if you've got 10 muscle twitches in a row, that you may program that. Maybe you don't often have 1,000 in a row that you can pre-program. So it really depends on how you're slicing it. But I'm pretty sure that the cerebellum is involved in even that kind of thing. Well, I don't know much about how sport works, observations of that, but certainly speech. The cerebellum is very heavily involved in speech. but you don't necessarily, and I think what's happening is that there are words you quite often use and phrases you quite often use, and depending on what you use most often, those kind of things can be coded in the cerebellum, even though you never have the same conversation twice. But on the other hand, fragments you use quite often, and then the cerebellum can code for those fragments. And then they can be...
analogy.
Yeah. Okay. So should I go back to Stephen and answer his question? Because Stephen had a question. So do you want to go?
If that's okay with you.
Well.
All right, perfect.
So we disagree, by the way. I have a philosophy that if two people agree on everything, one of them is unnecessary. So.
My question is related to artificial intelligence, but it's also with respect to behavior prediction. So only one of them I understand you'll feel more comfortable with. So a lot of your work has described being able to understand the mechanisms which underlie behavior and specifically cognition. What I'm trying to do is essentially go in reverse, create systems based on what we know about humans such that we can control their behavior. Specifically, we want, there's a lot of groups right now, for instance, DeepMind or OpenAI or independent startups that are working on creating algorithms that achieve goals in a wide range of environments. Some people call that intelligence. It's useful for achieving whatever those goals are, and they're not necessarily using the most efficient mechanisms for doing it, but that doesn't necessarily matter for their end goal because they just want a system that's able to do some goal. And if you can automate it, that can be quite lucrative, and that's the incentive. Are you aware of any reverse ordering, if you will, to be able to control such systems? So if you want to say, I want to start out with the desirable behavior, for instance, like an obedience system, how can we design something that's more amenable to following our goals or some specified set of rules?
Well,
and wait, can I add one addendum to that?
Mm-hmm.
The last thing I'd say is it's one thing to say in like a logic gate sense where we have like absolute truth. Yeah, don't do this, don't do that for prescribed things. But it's another thing to say don't do a goal if we can't enumerate all of them because of whatever constraint we have, or because these goal achieving systems are kind of based on probabilistic programming and they don't always put out a consistent output. They're not deterministic in some sense, or they're randomly deterministic.
Yeah. I think that as far as the brain is concerned, I think that certainly natural selection has placed, well, you basically have a situation where you detect receptive fields and those receptive fields recommend behaviors. If you want to bias the system, then you maybe predefine some receptive fields and you give them a lot of recommendation weight in favor of predefined behavior. So that certainly is one way of doing things. And I think that kind of approach can mean that you can define the goals of the system. Now, I think that the if you like, there's a trade-off there. Even in biological systems, a spider builds a web, and it can be a very complex web, but it appears to be genetically defined, the behaviors that construct the web, because two spiders of the same species will build more or less identical webs, or very, very similar webs. So there must be a lot of genetic information that's defining it. And I think that the problem then is that the more you define the behavior in advance, then the less the brain is going to be able to learn from experience. So you've always got to make that trade-off. So you can certainly place a heavy bias on future behaviors. And so I think the brain does have some the human brain has some strong biases that even things like interpreting a smile as a reward is something that's built into us. And to some degree we can learn to, or experience may change that and may bias it, but it's a fairly strong bias to start off with. And we probably have relatively strong genetic biases in favor of having fear in response to spider shapes and snake shapes. But in that case, because I think as I understand it, babies do tend to freeze if they see those kind of shapes. So it seems to be fair, even though it had no prior experience, but it does seem to be a genetically defined. But on the other hand, in that case, we can learn, and those biases can be overridden by experience. So I think that we can, and certainly so for an artificial system, I'm sure we could place biases by, as I say, defining the sort of conditions it was detecting. But then with the choice we have to make is to what degree do we want those initial biases to be overruled by experience, and to what degree do we want them to be locked in, and no experience could change them. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that thoroughly answers it. There's the trade-off too, where I guess your last point fully encapsulates what I was going to say, that doesn't answer, which is that you have to trade off what you don't want it to do later on versus what it was originally prescribed to do or told to do. So anyway, that's great. Thank you.
Is there any other students that have any questions before we're done?
Yeah, I had a quick question. How do you how do you prescribe a reward when you're not sure if whatever action you took is actually beneficial? How do you give a reward in that situation? For example, in soccer, you make a pass and it might have been a bad pass, but it leads to a goal. So you still shouldn't be looking at that as a reward, as a good outcome. So how do you reward a system that doesn't really know what the outcome is going to be?
Yeah. Okay. I think that the way that works, and remember that the brain is not infallible, and so the system is not necessarily going to be perfect. But I think that's what can happen though is that I think what I was saying earlier in the talk, that if you like, if you look at the situation in soccer, you have the hierarchy of you select strategic behaviors, tactical behaviors, specific behaviors, and very detailed behaviors. Now, if there's a reward like scoring a goal, then obviously you can't reward all of the muscle movements that led up to it. But on the other hand, I think you can, on average, probably what will happen is that you will tend to reward more tactical behaviors. And I think in practice, if you make a not particularly good pass, but it ends up having a goal, it'll probably, the behavior of making that pass may be slightly more likely in the future. And you probably rationalize that by saying, well, it was sort of a lucky event, but maybe it was also because it worked because that person was there and that person was there, and you managed to avoid it being intercepted because it wasn't quite such a good pass. So you might rationalize it that way, but in practice it may or may not be a good thing, but that it'll probably be rewarded and made slightly more likely in the future. But on the other hand, over time, if you make enough passes like that, and sometimes they work and sometimes they're a disaster, or more often they're a disaster, then probably the recommendation strength of that will tend to fade away a little bit. In other words, there'll be more negative rewards than positive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Did anyone else have a question before we break off?
It looks like it's time for you to start your break.
Yeah.
Are you ready for a break? If you want to just connect with us after your break with the seminar.
So I disconnect now and call into a different place, do I?
Yep, you can do that right now if you want. Just disconnect from this one and then connect with the other code.
Right. There's a personal link there. Do you want to come back at 3:40, or would you rather join now and then just take your break?
What choice was I getting there? I'm not...
You can drop off of here and I can start the seminar now and you can set your talk up, or you can come back around 3:40 and join it then, whichever you prefer.
Why don't I come back at 3:40?
Get out of your chair.
Yeah, right.
Thanks to all of you, and we'll start it up at 3:40. The students, you don't need to join till 4.
if I could make one comment, that if anybody wants to has any other questions or issues or anything you want to discuss, I've got an email, and you can certainly get it from Elan, I expect.
Yeah, you can get it from me. Yeah.
So if you feel like bugging me and if you disagree with something, then feel free to disagree.
Careful what you wish for.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you at the seminar this afternoon.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure meeting you.
Good meeting you too. Thanks very much.
Bye, guys.